Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. Before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. This week I have actually printed out some digital stamps from Tiddly Inks. These are stamps that I purchased or were freebies on their website. I have printed these stamps onto Nina Solar White Classic Crest 80-pound cardstock and put them through my laser printer. Toner through a laser printer does not smear with Copic markers, and sometimes inkjet printer ink does smear. I'm using Copic markers, like I said. I have 4 images, and we'll see how many colored images we need to get through our story. It is a long one, so grab a blanket, grab a snack, grab your drink, and let's talk crime. We have now entered the state of Nebraska. The statehood of Nebraska was a controversial subject. The territory of Nebraska, along with the Kansas Territory, had been organized in the mid-1850s. This kind of was a sticking point for the northern states because they were bitterly opposed to the extension of slavery and were demanding that Congress keep it out of newly organized territories. By 1867, the Civil War had decided the fate of slavery, and the new problem was whether or not the newly freed people would be granted the right to vote. The Nebraska Constitution, originally submitted to Congress, in common with the constitutions of most of the other northern states, restricted the right to vote to white males. Women were not even considered qualified to vote. So, Nebraska was admitted to the Union as the 37th state. However, congressional Republicans had passed a statehood bill for Nebraska in 1866, but President Andrew Johnson vetoed the measure. A second attempt in February of 1867 was more successful, with Congress overriding Johnson's veto to establish statehood for Nebraska. Nebraska is the only state admitted to the Union over a presidential veto. Now, in addition, Nebraska is the birthplace of Kool-Aid, which is funny because I think the idea is that Kool-Aid is a Southern person drink. At least, I'm kind of sort of in the South, and Kool-Aid is kind of like a staple. I don't know. It is home to a lighthouse with no ocean. Nebraska is where Arbor Day first began. The University of Nebraska State Museum features the largest mammoth fossil on display anywhere in the world. In the late 1800s, a law created in Lehigh, Nebraska, forbid merchants from selling donut holes. And that law was not repealed until the 1990s. And finally, Nebraska is home of the Great Sheedy Murder. John Sheedy was a noted booster, real estate developer, gambler, and sporting man. He lived a very public life. However, there was not a lot of information about his life prior to the 1870s, when he appeared in Nebraska and joined with Tunis P. Quick in partnership of a 3-story saloon, hotel, and boarding house. This boarding house had been constructed a few years before on the northeast corner of Government Square, like right where the courthouse is. As early as 1880, he was running a gambling casino, wowzers, on the second floor of this 3-story building. There were boarding rooms on the second floor next to John's casino, and the entire 3rd floor was used for rooms as well. The gambling hall was crowded at all hours by a large clientele, including the then mayor, Carlos Burr, and other prominent members of the town elite. Besides gambling, one could also enjoy, sorry you guys, words are super hard tonight, enjoy a drink and socialize with, quote, women of the town, sporting women, or other working class women in town, aka prostitutes, sex workers, whatever word you want to use for that group of individuals. The fact that by 1891, John had acquired a quarter interest in Tunis's building and operated the casino reflects the central role he played as a sporting man in Lincoln's culture. So John was kind of a man's man, right? He liked all the things. He liked the women, he liked the booze, he liked the gambling, and he liked the money he made from other people who shared his interests. John's casino generated love and hate from two separate groups of people. On one hand, John Sheedy was a hard-headed businessman who sought to protect his interests and hard-won turf by outcompeting and eliminating other gambling establishments. One person noted that he was a, quote, king among gamblers and excited jealousy among competitors. In his effort to establish a monopoly, he provided the best service at the most reasonable price, and, in the eyes of other gamblers, employed unfair tactics and brute force to intimidate others to prevent them from competing. He also aggressively protected the genteel venue of his casino by guarding the door and cracking down hard on patrons who did not or who could not pay or who became disorderly. Finally, or thirdly, fifthly, however many we've got in here, he also protected his casino by an arrangement in which he paid a monthly, quote, rent to the local police and police judge to look the other way and not raid his establishment or prosecute him for violations of the local anti-gambling code. There was literally in Lincoln, Nebraska, a town code that prohibited gambling, and yet he has established a casino across the street from this middle town hall, the government buildings. This, quote, rent he paid kept him from continual threat of being raided and shut down that all of the other gamblers or casino operators routinely faced in their efforts to run a gambling business. So on the other hand, John's casino, by flouting local laws against gambling, drew the ire of local reformers, a group of citizens who were anti-gambling, anti-prostitution, probably anti-public drunkenness, all of the things that these groups of people were typically opposed to in the late 1800s. And rather than operating at some secluded location, his casino stood brazenly just across the street from the courthouse, like I have mentioned, and openly challenged police and reform groups who wanted to eliminate the gambling vice, or at least push it outside of the downtown core of town. They wanted him outside the city limits. So John thus became the target of reformers and reformist groups who made numerous attempts, some as early as the mid-1870s, to arrest him and shut down his casino. Each time the casino was raided, it was closed for a while only to be reopened. John's successful gambling businesses did not come without his making enemies who did not refrain from attacking him right on the premises of his own business. So he was more than one time assaulted and beat up in his own business. John occasionally lived at the casino or used the boarding rooms in the building. After boarding in various places around the Lincoln, Nebraska town square, in about 1880, he took up boarding rooms at the brand new built Arlington Hotel, which happened to be on the northeast corner of the square. John's interest in P Street, so it appears in my research that the square of Nebraska City has numbers and letters. And this Arlington Hotel was on the corner of 9th and Q. And John's first hotel was on Goodness, I can't remember. I thought I wrote it down. I did not. But about the same place. Okay. John's interest in P Street extended east when he purchased a much sought-after lot 2 blocks east on the southeast corner of 12th and P Streets. So he's just a couple, 3 blocks over from this brand new hotel that he's now boarding in. There on the west edge of the residential district to the east, this property he now acquired on the 12th and P was kind of like the edge of the residential area. I don't know. I typed that in, not English. Sorry. After living in hotels and boarding rooms for most of his adult life, he had selected this area to build a mid-sized 4 or 5 roomed house, and he started building that in about 1884. Okay, back to my more legible notes here. While he was a resident at the Arlington Hotel, he actually met and began to have a relationship with Mary Merrill, who happened to be a hotel employee. Mary had come to Lincoln from Illinois with her second husband, George Merrill, having had divorced her first husband, Horace McCool, after he was sent to prison. In Lincoln, Mary and George would frequent the saloons and the gambling halls of the uptown district and then, get into drunken fights. And after one such fight that centered around Mary's alleged infidelities, George locked her out of their apartment. He then sold all of the furniture and moved back to Illinois, leaving Mary in Lincoln with nothing. While they were separated, Mary actually moved in with John Sheedy in the hotel. So she'd been staying in the hotel where she was working. And in 1882, she divorced George. Soon after John finished building the home on 12th Street, Mary moved in with him into his new home. John took Mary on a vacation to New Orleans, and Mary then gave him an ultimatum. Words are hard. I am so sorry. She told him he must marry her or she would not return to Nebraska with him. And when they returned to Lincoln, they returned as husband and wife and began to live a respectable middle-class life. However, trouble began to surface between them in the 1890s when they took a trip to Buffalo, New York, where Mary was treated for a, quote, disease peculiar to women. So I tried to find out what might be. Did she have some kind of a sexually transmitted disease? Was she having female problems? Did she need a hysterectomy? Was she pregnant and went for an abortion? I mean, I could not find what that phrase typically meant. I'm guessing she probably was having female issues with her reproductive organs. So, while in Buffalo, John and Mary had a fight, and John returned to Lincoln without her. He left Mary in Buffalo. And while she was there alone, she met and fell in love with Andrew Harry Wallstrom, who was a machinist and a traveling salesman. Eventually, Mary returned to Lincoln to reconcile with John, and Andrew followed her. This woman must have been beautiful. That's all I'm saying. She must have been a beauty. Or a really good sweet talker, because she's had now 3 husbands and a boyfriend. Just before 8 o'clock on Sunday evening, January 11th, 1891, John stepped out of the front door onto the front porch of his house on the corner of 12th and P Streets to go over to the Capitol Hotel. Suddenly, out of the shadows, beyond the reach of the front porch light, a man charged toward him, struck him on the side of the head with a leather-covered, steel-headed cane. Staggering, John drew his pistol and fired several shots. While one shot apparently grazed his assailant, The man ran across the south end of the porch. Then he jumped over the back fence and ran east through the alley toward 13th Street into the dark. The sound and flash of the shots startled the neighborhood. A number of people who had been out walking, even though it was a dark winter evening, as well as neighbors who heard and saw the shooting at John's brightly illuminated home, converged on the scene. As word spread of the assault, more and more people arrived from the adjacent neighborhoods, and soon a small crowd had formed by the gate and the front porch area. A few of the pedestrians on P Street saw the man that John shot, run south from the porch into the dark. The only other person besides John, however, apparently had seen a man run south down 12th Street and into an alley toward 13th Street. No one chased him. Other bystanders claimed in court that they saw two men running across the intersection of 12th and O Streets moments after hearing the gunshots. One of the neighbors from across the street saw John fire the second and third shots near the east side of the door, the part of the house facing south, before stepping back into his doorway. Dr. Everett, who was another neighbor from across the street, heard the shot, looked out his window, and saw the flashes from the other shots, and ran out of the door when he saw a crowd gathering at the gate of the Sheedy home. Identifying himself as a doctor, he pushed through the crowd and ran into the house. Louis Otto was a police officer who had been standing watch and also had heard the shots, and he ran in their direction as well. And he arrived at the house about the same time as another police officer, Officer Kinney, who had also been walking his beat. So they were quickly joined by Officers Adams and Bob Malone. So we have a whole handful of police officers and a doctor running toward John's house. Kinney later testified that a man told him he saw someone running down the alley toward 13th Street, but Officer Kinney did not see anybody. In the meantime, Mary, John's wife, still his wife, had rushed from the home, to help her husband back into the house and into the parlor, and she laid him down on the sofa. She called for a doctor and the police. Even at the same time, the Dr. Everett from across the street and the police officers had begun to arrive. So neighbors and looky-loos and rubberneckers, whatever you want to call them, just started gathering at the house and tried to push themselves in the front door. Another doctor, a Dr. Hart, and the chief of police arrived, and they cleared everybody out of the room. They forced everybody to leave the house and off the front, get out onto the street kind of thing. The doctors then moved John from the parlor to his bedroom. They had him sit down in the chair just inside the bedroom and inspected his severe head wound and then dressed it. The leather-covered steel head of the cane had cracked his skull and caused a substantial amount of bleeding. Another police officer who came on scene was a man named Marshall Mealick, and he was questioning John, who was still conscious, about the assailant. All John could tell him was that he came at him so fast he didn't really see him clearly. Later, some would contend that John knew his assailant but withheld that information. I don't know for what reason he would do that. However, that these same people claimed that the assailant ran down the alley south and east of the house while John was shooting at him 3 or 4 times. John apparently said the same thing to another person in the room, a saloon keeper. So there's a lot of people in the house, a lot of people around the house, a lot of police officers, a lot of doctors, a lot of people asking questions and trying to figure out who has come after John. Remember, he's got a wife that he's kind of sort of not in the best relationship with. He has a group of people who are trying to run him and his business out of the downtown area. He has prevented any other like-minded businesses from being able to open a business in the downtown part of area. So it's not like he was everybody's best friend. He was a good businessman, but he was not necessarily everybody's best friend. So there's lots of people who wanted or could have wanted John to be removed from, life. Eventually, the doctors did put John to bed and gave him some pain relievers, which is kind of important. A while later, Mary gave her husband some sleeping powder in a cup of coffee. And for the next hour or so, Mary let her neighbors and her friends and the looky-loos come in and visit with her, and she assured them that he was resting and he would be okay. He was resting well, he's going to be fine. Sometime in the middle of the night, apparently around 4 a.m., while he was sleeping, John was stricken with paralysis, and then he fell into a coma. While John lay in the back bedroom, the crowd grew around the house. Among them was a close friend of John's, Mr. Courtney. As a friend and an attorney, apparently, he had a conversation with Mary Sheedy about her husband's affairs, quote, just in case he should die. Meanwhile, downtown was abuzz with the news. People kept coming to the house during the day, and at some point, Mr. Courtney convinced people that these intrusions were not going to help John heal, and he locked the door. Mary and some of her close friends, whoever they were, held vigil beside John's bed all day, and Mary apparently kneeled most of the time next to the bed. One of Mary's friends, a Mrs. Swift, offered medical advice on how to treat John, but Mary told her it was, quote, useless to give him anything. And this was just before noon by all accounts. Mary occasionally asked John if he knew her at all, but received no response. He lingered through the evening and, with his wife and some friends by his side, died at about 10 p.m. Monday night, January 12, 1891, just about 26 hours after the attack. On Monday night, when word of John's death reached the county coroner, Dr. Holyoke, he rushed to the Sheedy house. He signed the death certificate and had the body transported to the new Lancaster County Courthouse for a coroner's inquest. The following morning, as Lincoln awoke to the news of John's death, Dr. Holyoke impaneled an inquest jury, assembling men gathered at the courthouse. At 9 o'clock in the morning, January 14th, an unprecedented number of reporters, policemen, lawyers, and politicians, including the mayor, crowded the jury room as the inquest began. A member of the jury, a Mr. Robert McReynolds, who was a prominent Reformation businessman, moved that the inquest be held in secret and insisted the press leave. Suspicious and infuriated reporters called the unprecedented closed inquest illegitimate, and they began eavesdropping through the transom windows and tried to force their way into the room. Upon unanimous agreement of the jury members, Dr. Holyoke moved the inquest to a small, unheated meeting room on the third floor. Though some jury members apparently doubted the blow could have caused Sheedy's death, the inquest concluded that he had been murdered, the death resulting from internal bleeding caused by a blow to the head. The question now was by whom and why. The cause of death on John's death certificate would in time become one of the central issues in the case against the person or persons accused of his murder. Now, some people in the town of Lincoln believe that the blow was indeed severe, cracking his skull, causing severe bleeding and probably a concussion. It should not have been damaging enough to kill him. Others would contend that the symptoms that John developed through the course of the night, the uneven pulse, the shortness of breath, the paralysis, the coma. They were consistent with a wound to the back of the head. Other people claimed that those symptoms more clearly were the signature of a drug overdose, in particular that of morphine, a painkiller. While the doctors said they had given John a singular dose of painkillers, suspicion would focus on the sleeping powders that Mary put in the coffee she gave her husband in the hours after the assault to help John at least achieve some comfort in sleep. Some skeptics ask why someone would hit somebody with a cane, or why somebody who had been hit with a cane, rather, would then show signs of morphine poisoning. And with all of these questions swirling in the air, the city was full of rumors and questions, and Mary Sheedy was suddenly sick and confined to bed. The day after her husband's death, Marshal Meelik and Officer James Malone pursued the murder in the most notorious crime in Lincoln's history to that point. So, at this point in history, this is the most notorious crime committed in Lincoln. It also was one of the most heinous crimes in the annals of American crime, according to some newspapers at the time. Officer Malone and Marshal Meelik interrogated residents and patrons of the area in search of witnesses and information. After the coroner's inquest, they continued to comb O Street and P Street, and within hours, they found a witness who, like Mary Sheedy herself, claimed to have seen a black man of middle height and build near the Sheedy house about the time of the murder. To the people who hung out at the area of P Street, that description fit one person in particular, a man named Monday McFarland, who happened to be a barber at a barber shop at 930 P Street, and he was also a popular patron of some of the area's bars and gambling clubs. Oh my goodness, sorry you guys. Wowzer. That should not have been that hard to get out. Later that day, Monday was said to have been seen on an extended gambling spree, and a group of rowdy men went in search of him, apparently with the intent of taking the law into their own hands. Their search was unsuccessful, but 3 days later, Meelik and Malone tracked down Monday. Malone actually found him at his barbershop on Saturday evening, January 16th, 1891. And as Malone noted, he took Monday into a doorway and asked him whether he had purchased a cane that they had found near the murder scene. A cane that had now been identified as a murder weapon and had been proven to have been purchased from Hyman Goldwater's pawn shop. Mr. Goldwater recognized the cane as one he received from a policeman and a jailer named W.W. Carter. So Mr. Carter had pawned the cane, and the pawn shop owner, Mr. Goldwater, claimed to have sold it to Monday McFarland. When Monday did not reply whether yes or no, they just took him to jail. Now, keep in mind, this is the late 1880s or late 1890s, early 1890s, and while Nebraska is a free state and the Civil War is over, Monday McFarland is a black man, and that was an issue here. They took him to jail. They continued to question him without a warrant. They continued to question him about the cane and where he had been the night of the murder. And then they locked him up on suspicion of murder. So they didn't really, they didn't protect his rights. And in the end, they didn't protect their case. Soon after Monday had been arrested and was locked in a dark, hot, sweaty room, they brought him out every once in a while to see if he was willing to talk. And this form of interrogation with Officer Kinney lasted for hours. At about 4 a.m., Officer Malone, apparently threatened Monday, saying that there was a mob forming outside. And at that point, Monday confessed to killing John Sheedy. I keep saying his name wrong. I'm afraid I'm going to swear and YouTube's going to flag me. Sheedy. Sheedy. The confession was delivered first to Malone and Kinney, and then the next morning to a larger group of people in the mayor's office that included Marshal Mielek, the mayor, police officer Kinney, Dr. Holyoke, the coroner, a stenographer, and Monday's confession implicated Mary as the instigator to the murder plot. So here the plot thickens. Monday claimed that after approximately a year of serving as her hairdresser at her husband's request, so Monday is claiming that John hired him to be Mary's hairdresser, and after a year of having done that Mary and Monday had become friends, and at some point in time, Monday had gained Mary's confidence. They became besties, right? During one of his weekly visits to Mary, she seemed particularly distraught and blurted out to him that her 8-year marriage to John was a sham. She then proceeded to tell him about her tumultuous past, a husband that she divorced who's in jail, a husband who brought her to Lincoln and then left her there, moving in with John. About the same time she was, kind of sort of working on that divorce. She also told Mary about her friend Harry, who followed her from Buffalo. See, so it's getting a little bit interesting here. She talked to Monday about having been instantly kind of overtaken by John and his money and his newly built home and his stature in the community, and that he was popular and flamboyant and he had power, and she was attracted to that. Mary also told Monday that marriage actually suited neither one of them. John was increasingly involved in gambling in his casinos. He resumed his more bachelor-style life with gambling and hanging out in the club. And Mary claimed he even had affairs with other women. And as she complained about his absences, he would just get angry with her. She even asked her friend Harry, the guy who followed her back from New York, to watch for her husband and to follow him to see if he was visiting two houses of prostitution. She was convinced that he had a specific lover there in that area. John was unwilling to listen to any criticism, and they often quarreled. And Monday told police that in the intimacy created by Mary's lurid tale, they embraced and their friendship deepened. Okay, so there's still a lot left to this story, even just doing the basics. So we're going to make a part 2 next week. And we'll finish up the confession and the trial and all of that stuff. I do want to throw in some pictures here. This is a picture of John. It's actually not a photograph. It's a sketch from a newspaper. Also, there's a picture of Mary. She looks like a pretty average woman, doesn't look like a killer. And there is a picture of Monday McFarland. His name is actually William Monday McFarland, but he did go by Monday. So come back next week to hear the rest of the story. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the first half of this story. I have added a couple of other videos here I think you would enjoy, as well as a subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment and a thumbs up, and have a great day.